Tēnā koutou katoa, haere mai ke tēnei hui, ke te mana whenua rangitānei, he mihi nui, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Good morning and welcome to Planning and Strategy Committee this morning. Just a quick run through of our housekeeping and safety procedures for our visitor. So if there is an alarm and we evacuate, we'll follow our committee administrators outside. A defibrillator is located on the ground floor at front of house, and if you need anything, sing out. We are recording our meeting and live streaming on our YouTube channel. Councillors may be aware we were going to be filming for some long-term plan comms this morning, but we've got a staff member away unwell, so that won't be happening today. And if you could just introduce yourself before you start speaking so that we have captured that for anyone online. First up, we have got apologies. We have an apology from Councillor Hapara for lateness and for Councillor Finlay. Are there any other apologies? Great, well, I will move, Mr Mayor.
Sorry, Madam Chair, I may have to leave on council business to go to Horizons, and I think a couple of other councillors may be coming as well. All depends how you go with the timing of this meeting. Yes,
I'm aware of that timing, and hopefully we will be done and dusted by then.
Thank you.
Councillor Beattie.
Same as the Mayor, thank you.
Okay, early departure. Anyone else? Great. I will move those, seconded by Councillor Hancock. I'll invite you to vote. Great, that has carried 100%. Moving on to item 2, I haven't had any notification of additional items. Keep going. Are there any declarations of interest? Great, moving down to public comment. We have a public comment from Shane Telfer from the Manawatu Mountain Bike Club. Good morning, Shane. So you'll have 3 minutes to speak, and we can take questions if there are any at the end.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for the opportunity to comment. I'll keep things quick. So my name is Shane Telfer. I'm the chair of the Manawatu Mountain Bike Club, so representing about 800 members in the local region. Our organisation is involved in events, development and trail construction, and you may know us from our work at Arapuki, which we gladly receive support from the council, both monetary support and support from council staff who encourage our activities up there. Today I'm going to be talking though about the Turitea area. So set down for today's meeting, here you have a plan for the reserve management of the Turitea Reserve. So I'd like to point out that there are significant recreational possibilities in this area, and the current plans are to adopt option 2, which is a partial review focused on addressing the key issues of biodiversity and the partnership with tangata whenua. So absent from those, from the current plans are recreational opportunities, but there are many recreational opportunities in this area, and the plan was last reviewed about 15 years ago. So I think it's a little too long to wait for another 15 years until we get to see some movement on recreational opportunities. There's been a lot of development in this area, especially around South Range Road, and there are areas around Hardings Park where we can imagine some significant recreational opportunities emerging. So this is not only for mountain biking, but there's also walking, fishing and other opportunities that may be explored. So Without preempting what the review might uncover, I would like to suggest, or my recommendation would be, that a broader picture is taken into account for this review, and so that the council opts for a broad option 2 or perhaps option 3 when reviewing this management plan. Thanks.
Thank you, Shane. Councillors, are there any questions? Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Shane, for coming in to talk to us. Currently, there's no mountain biking access to any of those areas for your club, is that correct?
No, in general, no, not to the Turitea area, as far as I can work out the boundaries there from the maps that I can work out online. No, so there's no access to South Range Road, for example. There's no access into the area around the water reserve, nor Hardings Park, Ongatane, and so on. There is Arapuki, of course, but that's a different area.
Okay. And so are you thinking that we should go for a wider consultation, a wider public review on this to gather thoughts, I suppose, from wider members of the public?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's my recommendation, is to now just explore the opportunities that exist and that have emerged over the last 15 years in that area, yeah.
So just to give us a bit of context, and for those of us who weren't on council 15 years ago, what was the situation with the Mountain Bike Club 15 years ago compared to today, say, just to give us a sense of what's changed in that time?
It was much, much smaller, much more constrained, much more focused on sort of events and development, and rather than this area around Arapuki and the adjoining areas. So yeah, we didn't have the same broad perspective like we have now, and we didn't have the same demand for riding opportunities. The number of riders has grown, and the demand for trails and access to trails has really blossomed in the last few years.
Okay, thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Mr Mayor.
Madam Chair, Councillor Johnson has just asked all the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Shane. There's no further questions. I will move that the public comment be received for information, seconded by Councillor Hancock. And I'll invite you to vote. That has carried 100%. Moving on to item 5, confirmation of minutes from the 9th of December. I'll move that they be confirmed as a true and correct record, seconded by Councillor Hancock. Thank you. Are there any comments? Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a very minor issue, which I meant to email and forgot, sorry. On the first page, it says that Councillor Bowen left the meeting at 12:03 p.m. On the second page, it said that she left the meeting at 11:20 a.m, so perhaps that just needs to be aligned.
Thank you. We will double check that one. Right, no further comments. I'll invite you to vote. That has carried 13 in favour and 1 abstention. Item 6 on page 11, the Recycling, Waste Management and Minimisation Bylaw 2016 Administration Manual, Analysis of Submissions and Recommendation. And I'll invite Mike to come down and speak to that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, I'd like to ask Natasha Hickmott to join me. Good morning, Madam Chair, Mr Mayor and Councillors. We'll present this report as read.
Thank you. Councillors, are there any questions? Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks, Mike and Natasha. Few questions. I guess, so how long has this situation been, I guess, triggered off in terms of China sort of pulling back? We're a couple of years in now, aren't we?
Yeah, it's about 2 years.
Yeah. And I guess, are we, to my read of the paper, it seems like we're still sort of operating and or trying to find a sort of transactional solution to waste problems, and that hasn't sort of worked. So now we're talking about, dumping it in the tip, basically. Have we sort of gone down the partnership sort of options side of things, looking to see if we can partner with somebody to actually establish or expand, I suppose, the recycling opportunities in the local community so that we could keep these materials out of landfill?
I guess if you'd like us to look into that, we could. That would require some resources, some investigation and some consultancy money to look into that, and it would likely result in some capital expenditure required to build a facility, which we did discuss in the report.
And I guess just thinking about the sort of sequence of events, would it be logical to sort of explore all options before we get to the community and say we're going to cut off a portion of your service?
I think the last report that was presented in November explained the problem we've got is the storing of the mixed plastics up at Aupuni. We've come to the point where we can no longer safely stockpile that material, so we need a solution.
Are there storage opportunities that are, I guess, intermediate, somewhere between a hole in the ground and just leaving exposed to the elements there that are indoors, undercover?
Not to our knowledge at the moment, but we haven't explored more storage opportunities.
Thank you. I guess a couple other questions. One was around the budget allocation around communication out to the community. That there's $10,000 set aside. Can you help us understand how much that actually gets us in practical terms?
By your chair, can I ask Alicia Liv to answer that question? Sorry.
Morning. So the majority of that money, about $8,000, is going to go on a quite a thorough wee pamphlet that we're going to give residents, which talks about the changes, some key kind of contamination issues that you guys are aware of at the moment, some things we want to see not in bins, and reminding people of some of our other recycling services as well. Some really clear examples of what they shouldn't be putting in anymore as well. The remainder of the budget is social media and digital advertising, some newspaper advertising, working with some of our radio stations on some content. So I've been talking to them about getting them to come down to the recycling facility, sorting that kind of, so some more free education-based things that we can partner up with them on. And doing some more kind of free comms, which is where we provide information to all the childcare centres and all of the schools and get them to push it out. With Massey, with UCOL, with the DHBs, with all of the big organisations, we do stuff via free means as well. And because we've designed this pamphlet, we can pick and piece bits together to create that and make it all digital for free. So we think that budget is pretty, it's going to provide good spread.
All right, thank you. So just to clarify, perhaps before you go, the focus of that $10,000 campaign is around the understanding the change that's being proposed in terms of differentiating different numbers of plastics, rather than an overall message around reducing plastic consumption in the first place, because there's some language in the report about that happening in the future too.
Yeah, so what we're going to focus on for that budget is the changes, but also just because we understand that it is quite confusing, it is only about 5% of what is in your recycling is using it as a reminder of what should and shouldn't be going into your recycling bin. So kind of like a refresh of what should and shouldn't be going in there with an element of these changes, but also just some of the common things that we're starting to get into the recycling centre that we want to really stop. So your nappies, your needles, your medical equipment, that kind of thing as well. And The reason we don't want to merge a general, I guess, consumer thing with a project like this is that we only really want to go out public with a few key points and a few key messages, so it really sinks in, they really get the hang of it, wait a few months and then go and do like a separate campaign. And the reason for that is people generally, once they get overloaded with lots of information, one of the risks is that they just turn off from it altogether. So if we go with a really clear, focused campaign on this, we believe we'll get a better success rate.
Thanks. So then could I understand for that second campaign, how much resource is sitting, I assume it's sitting in the long-term plan for kicking off in future years. How much actual resource do we have to put behind a campaign around focusing on reduced plastic use in the community?
So we'll be coming back to you into the Environmental Sustainability Committee on the 19th of May with a report around a wider communication and a communication plan on reducing waste in general, and particularly reducing your plastic use in your home. And along with that, we'll have some information about what that might cost in terms of the long-term plan and how we can.
Thank you. So is there already an allocation in the 10-year plan, or are you talking about an adjustment to the 10-year plan?
So at the moment, there isn't an allocation in the 10-year plan for that because we'd already finished preparing the budgets for the 10-year plan when you requested that report to come back to us, for us to come back to you with a report. In saying that, yesterday the government announced, the MFE announced that the waste levy will go up on 1 July. And so there'll be some extra waste minimisation levy funding. I'll need to confirm with our waste management minimisation plan if that aligns with the expenditure, but we may be able to utilise some of those funds to help pay for that communication strategy.
Great. Thank you both, Madam Chair.
Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question has been answered.
Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think some of what Councillor Barrett's already asked, but you spoke about not exploring in detail any other options rather than just going to landfill. You're aware other councils are doing some, like this plastic fence posts and all that being created, I suppose, out of like a plastics oil or plant?
Yes, so to answer that, we have done some investigation into the likes of future plastics and future posts and things like that. They don't present a full solution to our mixed plastics grade is the problem, and that is detailed in the report. I'm not quite sure which page, but in the report it does suggest which plastics that they can and can't use. So that doesn't give us a full solution.
That's the advice at the time. Waste minimisation, national changes. Surely we're not all going to just bury plastics in the ground as a nation. There must be some changes coming.
So as you're aware, there's an aggressive work program from the Ministry for the Environment to actually look at removing some of the 3, 4, 6s and 7s from the single-use plastic. The primary focus is the 3s and 6s to begin with, and then the 4s and 7s. So it is definitely clear from what the messaging and the signaling I'm getting from MFE is that they would like councils to only collect 1s, 2s and 5s in our curbside recycling, and that they will look to other options for the 3, 4, 6s and 7s. The 3s and 6s, as I said, were subject to a consultation that the Ministry undertook at the end of last year, of which Council put a submission in on. Future posts are definitely an option, and I did detail that in the report. They can take 1, 2, 4, 6 and 7 from memory. I think they can't take 3. They're also quite an expensive option, and we would also have to freight that to Auckland. We would also have to look to investing a capital investment in our MRF because they can't accept 1s. They definitely can't accept 1s. So we would have to have some significant investment in our MRF if we were to look at that as a valid option.
Sorry, Madam Chair, you've teased out some more questions. What's a significant investment? What do you mean for number 1s?
So number 1s are PET, and they are primarily.
I know what they are. What do you mean by the significant investment?
It would be an optical sorter at the MRF, and I would imagine, I mean, I don't have an exact figure, and I would be giving you a ballpark figure, Mr. Mayor. Are you happy with a ballpark figure?
Yeah.
We would be looking at $500,000 to $1 million investment at the MRF.
All right. The plastic oil business case, which some of your colleagues were working on, which didn't get government funding. Do we know where that's sitting at the moment? Is it just been shelved and at this stage?
So if you recall, Mr. Mayor, Council gave us approval subject to seeking an equivalent amount from the Provincial Growth Fund to proceed with the plastic to oil project. We did not receive the funding from the Provincial Growth Fund, and as far as I'm aware at the moment, that is on hold. Whether that will proceed, I am not sure at this stage. So if Council wanted to look at the plastic to oil project, we would need to consider the Council fully funding that project with our own funds, which would be in the order of $2 to $2.5 million. Also, the plastic to oil project is not a solution for all of the mixed grade plastics. Plastic to oil can't take 3, for example, it's the PVC, and it can only take a small percentage of the 6s.
Okay, and just final question, your colleagues over at Manawatu District and their recycling hub, is there a solution there? Have we spoken to them about taking some as being feedstock for that plant?
Yes, I have spoken to MDC. At the moment, their plastics facility that they were looking at constructing is also on hold, as they had applied to the Provincial Growth Fund for that, so that project is also on hold. I am aware that they have made land available to a private consortium to build a waste-to-energy project. That waste-to-energy project has not, would require capital funding privately. Where that is at, I am not sure. But if it was to proceed, it is at least 12 months away and would be subject to capital funding.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Hancock.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thank you both. Look, I've just got a few questions here, and it's really just to provide a little bit more sort of clarity, I guess, around some of the information for us. Paragraph 4.8, you reference the health and safety issues in terms of stockpiling. Can you just articulate what are those health and safety concerns?
Excuse me, this was detailed in the last report, so we might just reference that. Why Natasha's trying to find it in the last report, it was essentially the stockpiling of that material is starting to degrade due to the exposure to the environment, UV lights. So there was a risk that some of that would end up inadvertently in our river framework catchment area, and also the fire risk of 300 tonnes of plastics being kept on site, plus the environmental risk of obviously rodents and other feral creatures are starting to populate around that area too. So there's quite a significant risk by keeping it in stockpile.
Yeah, I'm just trying to perhaps just tease this out so we're clear in terms of future options. If we were to continue stockpiling, say for example, for another year or 2 years, would those health and safety issues arise other than fire perhaps? Like I'm just trying to actually get some clarity around this in terms of risk, because we can actually say it's a health and safety risk, but it may actually be a very low risk in the short term and an increasing risk going forward. So I just want to understand that. Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, there's two things here. There's space constraints, which we've already alluded to. We've actually run out of room, and there's the health and safety risk and the impact on the environment where the current bales are stored. If we was to investigate future storage options, we'd probably need to go away and come back to council on that.
Yeah, thank you. Also referenced in the report here, there is the cost of chipping is, it's inferred that chipping the plastic, which of course would actually improve our storage options, that the cost is actually prohibitive. So do we actually understand what the cost of that might be?
No, I haven't investigated that, Councillor Hancock. I don't actually know how much it would cost, but it would be a capital investment in some equipment that we don't currently have, which would be to chip it. And then we would need to have some sort of containers to store it. Obviously, chipped plastic would need to be stored in a very sealed container to avoid it escaping to the environment.
Sure, thank you very much. And just finally, also just for clarity, because I think the information has been in previous reports, just in terms of the impacts of plastics 3, 4, 6 and 7 being included to the landfill, what are the impacts of that in terms of the lifespan of the landfill? What's the volume increase in terms of material going into landfill as opposed to being recycled?
It's only 5% of the recycling. It's quite a small volume, quite a small weight. And in fact, for the last few months, I've actually been sending my 3, 4, 6s into the landfill. At home, I use the council rubbish bags. It has not increased the amount of rubbish bags that I personally use in my home. We know that the current landfill that we utilise, which is the privately owned landfill out at Bonnie Glen, recently, probably 2-3 years ago, expanded their resource consent for what they call airspace, and at that time they had another 80 years of landfill space on the current volumes going to landfill. So I would imagine that that would be not a dissimilar figure at the moment, so that at this moment in time there is quite a lot of landfill space available to us in the future.
Thank you. And finally, I guess just the question around if we were to agree to the recommendation that these plastics actually do go to landfill, how are elected members going to have some, or have some comfort, or the public have some comfort around the fact that we're exploring other opportunities to actually not landfill this waste?
Sorry, we just had to have a little conversation there. So I think this is the bigger picture on what the government is trying to achieve, what the MFE is trying to achieve, which is actually minimising the numbers of plastics in distribution. And so to try to minimise that from even being generated in the first place, at the end of the day, if we look at the waste hierarchy, at the beginning of the waste hierarchy, right at the top is to reduce or minimise those wastes being produced and being used in the environment in the first place, which is where I think we should be putting our emphasis, is to encouraging people to look for alternatives, to look for other items that they can use that aren't actually manufactured from 3, 4, 6 and 7s, so that where we have very good, viable onshore options for recycling and processing for the 1s, 2s and 5s, we utilise those products in terms of the single-use plastic packaging that we produce and use at home.
Yeah, so for clarity, just to make sure that we nail this down, is that council officers will continue to monitor progress happening nationally through the Ministry for Environment, and you would be in a position to be able to report back to elected members and the public in terms of that progress?
Yes, certainly, Councillor Hancock. We do keep I have a really good relationship with staff from the MFE, and I'm constantly in contact with all of my other close territorial authority officers on where we are with recycling and waste minimisation and what can and cannot be processed, yeah.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Councillors, are there any other questions? No further questions. Thank you both, and thank you, Liv. So we have got the recommendations on screen. Anybody wanting to move those? Councillor Hancock? I will second them. Councillor Hancock, did you want to speak to those?
Thanks, Madam Chair. Yes, look, the only comment I really need to make on this is that certainly in the short term, this is really the only sensible option that we currently have. And I suppose the only proviso that I would like to, and I'm sure that the council officers will do this for us, is that subsequently, if this is actually approved, there'll be some reporting back into council about any viable options going forward. Those are my comments. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Look, I have some issues with this, and I think it was borne out by some of the questions. Firstly, clearly we've got to change the packaging and manufacturers' processes and behaviour in using these hard plastics. To continue to use 3, 4, 6 and 7 is not only a national problem, it's a global problem. But are we trying to just push this aside, put it down a hole, blindly put it to a landfill and she'll go away? You've seen the submissions. I've been contacted by many just normal residents that say, what are you guys doing? They are struggling with the communication. They don't understand what's going on. I believe blindly just sending them to the landfill is not the right option at this stage. We do have some other options. I mean, we've just heard that waste minimisation plans from the ministry are changing pretty well by the month, and I guarantee there will be a national option for this. There's got to be. We can't, if we're doing this, what do you think Christchurch is doing, or Dunedin or Wellington? So I would I'm not going to support these. I do think that we can do something else and perhaps in a year's time be able to see what is happening with our colleagues at MDC. Officers have advised that the building is stopped. I'm not quite sure that's what has happened, but there are other opportunities, I believe, with plastic oil, with the fence post opportunities, with chipping. There's got to be a better way than just sending it to a landfill. This is the easy option, out of sight, out of mind. I've been to Bonnie Glen. Yep, it can take it. Is it the right thing to do? No. So I won't be supporting this. And if it fails, I'd look to put up a notice of motion that we stockpile it for a period of time and we ask officers to seriously look at some other options. I think we've blindly gone down a pathway of just sending it to the landfill because it's just easy. It's out of sight, out of mind. I won't be supporting it.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I will be supporting it. And I think that what we need to be clear about here is that officers have told us of the issues that we currently have in storing this material. Now, it's not very palatable to send it to landfill, but we don't actually, at this moment, have a sensible other alternative. So just voting against this because we want to demonstrate that we're not happy with putting plastic in landfill isn't really a very practical option. We've been told that the amount of plastic that's accumulated now is such that storage is an issue, that the plastic is degrading. We don't want little bits of plastic in the river. And until there is another option viable that we can move to, then I think the only practical option we have is to send it to landfill. I don't agree that it's blindly sending it to landfill, and I certainly don't agree that we should just pretend it's not an issue by saying that we're not going to send it to landfill. We've been presented with a problem, we've consulted on it. Nobody really wants to send plastic to landfill, but we're in a bit of a difficult situation. So I think we've just got to be realistic and pragmatic about this at the moment. There's no other viable option. If there was, I'm sure we'd all be going to it tomorrow. But there isn't. Once there's a viable option in place, sure, I'll be the first to support it. But in the meantime, I think we've just got to be sensible.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I obviously do find this quite a concerning and somewhat vexed decision in terms of what we do, because there isn't obviously a great decision in front of us, and I think that's what some of what Councillor Johnson's alluded to in her comments. My view on it is that the main reason that we don't yet see the sensible, viable alternatives is that we haven't really doubled down our efforts in terms of what the short and medium term options are, and I think we would be wise as a council to put some emphasis there before bringing a major disruption of service to the community. The community has been in the habit for a number of years of actually going through a lot of hard work to set aside specific plastics for recycling, to tell them that we're not going to be providing that service anymore, and chuck a whole lot of the stuff that they've set aside over the last year or two in the ground, to me doesn't sit very well, and I think that's the sort of signal we got back through the consultation process. Actually, nobody really does want to see this just go to landfill. So what I would like to see is a lot more serious investigation around the partnership options, the storage options, what's happening in central government that might, within 12 to 24 months, actually give us a real opportunity to move forward with this. And my concern is that if we were to cut that service off now, getting people back on board in 12 to 24 months would be very, very difficult. Cutting a service now is going to shove a whole lot more people onto wheelie bin services and filling those wheelie bins up with all the plastic. Getting it back out of those wheelie bins in 12 to 24 months, very, very difficult. So yes, absolutely acknowledge that there isn't a great solution here, but I would be very much in line with where the mayor is going on this to say, let's actually double down our efforts to find partnership options that can work in a local context next, say, 12 months and revisit it at that point. Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Dingwall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Like a lot of you, this is one that's caused me a lot of debate in my own household, actually. I have had many an argument with my husband over the breakfast table on this very issue. And it is because there are a lot of issues at play here. There's a lot of people who should be held accountable for the sheer amount of plastics we have in our society at the moment. This is a problem that's come up because society has changed the way that we use plastics, actually, over the last few years. And it's very hard to change behaviour when you kind of ignore it, or just, create a system where there's a recycling bin, you can just throw it in the recycling bin and not worry about it. But actually, recycling needs to be the last resort. We need to be reusing things and actually refusing it in the first place. When we go through the supermarket, as painful as it is, and I know because I do it often, we actually have to be looking at all these different packages and figuring out which ones we can accept here in our city. We cannot say, put your recycling in a recycling bin if we're not actually going to recycle it. That is misleading to the public. And so, whilst I fully understand the issues that we've got here, and the fact that we don't have very many solutions at the moment. I mean, I'm not a fan of putting plastic in landfill, but I'm also not a fan of collecting yet more plastic to, tell the community, yeah, we might do something with it, but actually we also might not, and it also might end up in landfill anyway. What we need to be doing is spending a lot more time and energy and resources educating the community about what we can actually do with these plastics, and trying to change that behaviour. And I don't think that trying to find solutions on other things to do with plastics after we've used them is very efficient for us at the moment as well. It's a real struggle, because at the end of the day, this wouldn't be an issue if we weren't buying the plastics in the first place. And so if people are struggling to figure out which plastics they should be using, maybe we should actually be focusing a lot more on just not having plastics at all. So I do know that there's a lot of issue within the low waste and the zero waste movements around how easily we're just ignoring what happens at the other end of it. And I think that actually needs to be brought right forward as the clear focus and be part of a lot of our comms So yeah, I am conflicted on this one.
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, as the Mayor said, we're not alone in struggling with this. It's an international and national problem as well as a local one. As other members have said, nobody wants to see plastic in landfill. Possibly even more, we don't want to see microplastic in our waterways. I think what this difficult decision shows is there is actually no good solution because recycling itself is not a solution. Behaviour has consequences. Our individual purchasing behaviour has consequences, and the City Council has come up against a lack of good solutions in that space. And I agree with Councillor Dingwall that it will be misleading to pretend that we can recycle materials that are in fact not recyclable at the moment in the current market. And even if we had the money to investigate some of those things, which we don't, there isn't a good, obvious solution. If there was, we'd be doing it, as others have said. So I don't like it, but this is the reality of it. And I was encouraged by the officer's comments around the comms in this, that we have to get better at telling people that their behaviour has consequences. And if they're bothered enough to be ringing elected members about recycling, then maybe they should be bothered enough to think about what they're buying.
Councillor Beattie.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I can see it from both sides, but I think for me, the issue I have is that if you start stockpiling this, in 3 months there'll be a motion coming to council to say, can we have $1 million to chop this up? Then we'll have, can we have another 300,000 to store it? And it will go on. And to me, the most sensible thing, if we're going to spend money, I'd rather spend the $500,000 going back to source so that people stop buying the stuff from the supermarket and working with central government and other councils. Have this just as an interim solution that we dump it so that we don't have the issues and we're not, and then put the money, any money that we were going to look at chipping or anything else, or spare money that we've got, let's work collectively with all the other councils and see what is out there, like what are MDC doing, what are Wellington doing, and see if our money isn't better spent jointly with a one-off project, or at the end of the day working with government and knocking on their door and saying, look, let's get rid of this through people not buying the product. So I will be supporting the recommendation.
I'm just going to make a brief comment. I am going to support the recommendations in front of us from officers. I, like others, share the reluctancy to be sending plastics to landfill. It is something that I'm really struggling with, but I think, as others have mentioned, we're actually in an environment where we don't have a particularly wide range of choices, especially if we are looking at affordability and cost when we're weighing up all the other decisions that we're making as a council at the moment. The other issue I just want to highlight is that I think it's pretty easy to suggest that people refrain from buying plastics, but that choice comes with an incredible amount of privilege. Often alternatives such as glass do cost more at the supermarket, so there's a privilege of having the income to be able to make those choices, the privilege of having time to go around various supermarkets or bulk food stores, doing that sort of thing to go out of your way to avoid plastics. That's the privilege of time that not everybody has. So I agree that we need to go back and work with people at the source, but I think we just need to be really mindful of going out and just telling people just to not buy plastic, because we also need to be mindful that actually it's a very privileged position to be in, to say to people that you have got the ability to make that choice. So I think that what we've heard from officers around the comms plan of essentially putting it into a two-stage of talking about the changes and then focusing on a low plastic consumption sort of plan, I think is very good. But yeah, we just need to be mindful of actually the position, putting people in the position of making decisions that they may not be able to make. Councillor Hancock, did you want a right of reply?
No, I think it's all been said, Madam Chair.
Thank you. With no further comments then, I will invite you to vote. That has carried 10 in favour, 4 against and 1 abstention. Moving on to item 7, the Turitea Reserve Management Plan Review. And I'll invite Robert Van Bentum to come and speak to that. So this is on page 155.
Thanks, Madam Chair, councillors. I've just asked David Miller, my Activity Manager Water, to join me, so in the event there's a few questions. So while we take the report largely as read, I suppose just a few comments I'd make are what we essentially need to do is to go through a formal review for the Turitea Reserve Management Plan. It's obviously a statutory obligation, something that's well overdue. We've given you really 3 options. All options are about engaging and consulting with all interested parties. They're just really around the balance between what we call focused engagement and more general consultation. So we've recommended option 2, which is really a balance between the level of investment by staff and engagement and the time period and cost, balanced with, the objectives of the review. So I think the thing to bear in mind with this reserve, it is a special, most of it's a special purpose reserve in terms of it being the water supply for the city. So we're keenly aware of the risk profile for any activities within the reserve. And within that context, most of what we're interested in focusing on is around the biodiversity and the meaningful engagement with tangata whenua in terms of being important within their sphere. So there are portions of the reserve, such as Hardings Park, which do not fit that same criteria. So they may well be. There may be other options in that instance. So I think I'll leave it there, and we're open to questions. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Robert. In terms of the contamination concerns, which are mentioned in paragraph 3.1, can you explain what type of contamination you're concerned about that might occur with public access?
Well, there are no toilet facilities within the reserve. So any activity, any human activity, biking, walking, cycling, introduces the very real risk that people will essentially make use of the reserve. So, and that is a very direct health risk. So that's basically human bacteria then entering into the raw water space, and so, in terms of, there's an opportunity for us to basically manage that and minimise that risk by preventing public access. So, I mean, that's the purpose, I suppose, of having a protected catchment, is to, and one of the obligations of our, what was called the Water Safety Plan, is to take every reasonable measure to minimise the potential risk of contamination. So,
okay, so a follow-up question then. That contamination would presumably be eventually funnelled into the reservoir and then presumably would go through the water treatment plant as in every other type of contamination, would it
maybe
not?
David can comment on that.
Tēnā tātou, Madam Chair, Your Worship, councillors and officers. So there's really two things, and there's two parts of the drinking water standards that we're looking at here. Robert's mentioned the bacteria, which is the smaller ones like the E. coli and so on, but the other one and the more concerning one is the protozoa. And that's the term for a group of organisms like Giardia, like Cryptosporidium, and there's a very real risk of those. So with our catchment at the moment, because it's so well managed and so well protected, we're bumped down to what's called a 3-log catchment, which means that there's a massive amount of treatment that we don't need. If, say, for argument's sake, at the other end of the spectrum, if it was run-of-river like some councils, or we had completely wide open access as they do at New Plymouth on the Waiwakaiho, that would make us a 4-log catchment, and then immediately we would have to install UV treatment at Turitea Water Treatment Plant in order to become compliant, and we'd be non-compliant until then. And the more concerning thing, of course, is that we wouldn't have the additional barrier in place to effectively treat the protozoa and be comfortable about the water.
Am I all right to continue? Yes, thank you. You may not be aware that I'm a veterinary surgeon, so I certainly understand about protozoa and bacteria. There are lots of protozoa and bacteria in animal and bird life. So how is it any different with the protozoa that might be coming from birds or possums or anything else, or bacteria, compared to the ones that might be coming from the small number of people that would be walking through the reserve?
Absolutely correct, Councillor, in terms of the source, and for the benefit of others here, that's why we have a predator control program up in Turitea. Basically, any mammal can carry these kinds of things, and if you're looking at Cryptosporidium, you've got the birds as well. And so we've actively managed the predator numbers, and we had a really good meeting with Peter Hancock of Ground Truth last week, and the success of the program has been exceptional. But water supply is really risk management. So if we're going to raise the risk by having people in there, I'm not saying we couldn't do it, but we have to put in additional steps in order to mitigate that risk. So with any opening up of the reserve, we add more layers of risk that we have to deal with.
But surely we've got UV treatment already to treat protozoa?
No. Not at Turitea Water Treatment Plant, because we don't require it at the moment, because we're managing the catchment.
So if protozoa got into the water supply, how would there must be some mitigation in place?
Sorry, I probably have to clarify that. We don't have UV for protozoa treatment, which is your kind of Rolls-Royce kind of option that'll catch everything. We have filtration, so we have sand filters there. The part of the drinking water standards is called enhanced individual filter performance. There's no test on that, don't worry about remembering that. But we have a barrier in place. It's just not as strong a barrier as we'd be required to have if there was more risk in the catchment.
Right, okay. Thank you. So in terms of the Hardings Park, this is a separate area of question, Madam Chair, if that's okay. In terms of the Hardings Park, which is outside of the water supply catchment, is there any reason why that couldn't be opened up to become more of a recreational area from a water supply point of view?
Not from a water supply point of view. There would just be
Is
a
there
question
some-
of how it might be managed or controlled or, yeah.
The main reason at the moment we still have it included in the management of the Turitea Reserve is around the pests, in particular the deer, and that's something that could be managed. And so I think in terms of recreation, if we were going to look anywhere, we would be looking there. But we just want the surety that the control of the pest was effectively managed there, because anything that's in Hardings Park could quite easily come up to Turitea and be a problem there.
Okay, yep. And so if we opt for option 2, does that give the general public the opportunity to comment on the reserve plan and have their comments considered, or do we need to go to option 3 to allow that?
No, all options have a consultation with the public, so option 2 does that. It just doesn't single out particular groups for detailed engagement. So there's a full submissions process which will allow for that feedback, yeah.
All right, thank you very much for those answers.
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the report. I have to say I was a bit confused by figure 1, and I wondered if you could explain it to me. Which bit actually is the reserve? So it says it's the Turitea catchment, it's Browns Flat, it's Harding Park, but those are 3 separate areas.
Apologies, councillor, that was the clearest map I could get to explain that. It's not 100% clear, but I'm very grateful that Aaron put that together and shared it. So where we're talking about here specifically is, as mentioned in the caption for the figure, Turitea catchment, which is the water supply catchment, Browns Flat, just to the west there, sticking out, and Hardings Park. Those three are currently within the Turitea Reserve. That's not to say as part of any review process that they would necessarily remain as part of that reserve and be looked after by the water supply activity.
Okay. Thank you, I think. It's not a great map. Maybe we need to get a better one. My question was around recreational access, and it's a question because I didn't really understand the map. How does the dam block access from the top of Greens Road round to Turitea figure in this? So there's a walking, cycling pathway from the unsealed end of Turitea Road through to the top of Greens Road.
I don't think that passes through the reserve. I'm not aware of that, but maybe Aaron might be able to answer.
Could you just repeat your question, councillor?
So the access way for cycling and walking, which I think is colloquially known as the dam block, which is what triggered my question, goes from the unsealed end of Turitea Road to the top of Greens Road. So my question is that within the reserve, or does it form the boundary of the reserve?
There is no cycle track through the reserve, so I'm pretty sure it's on the boundary or outside the reserve. So yeah, I don't.
Aaron was giving you the thumbs up from behind there, so that forms the boundary of the reserve.
Apologies, councillor, for the inability to answer that succinctly. The focus for me has been mostly on the water supply catchment part of it.
Fair enough. I think, so what that's saying to me is people are already very close to the border of the reserve, if not within it. There might be some discussion there. And has that caused any problems to the water supply that we're aware of?
Well, they're not in the reserve. There's a fence and there's a catchment gradient. So essentially they're on tracks which drain out of the reserve. So no, I mean the only access that has been permitted prior to the wind farm development has been for deer shooters on a permit-based arrangement, and that's been primarily for us to help us manage cost-effectively the deer population. So there hasn't been any issues because there has not been any public access really to the reserve. So yeah.
But the deer hunters are public?
Yeah, well, I mean essentially they're going in on a limited basis in small numbers. Yeah.
But that's not caused any problems as far as we know?
Not as far as we're aware.
Okay. Thank you.
And on the deer control aspect of it, just to add to that, they're going in there to remove large mammals that can cause issues with the water quality as well as to the biodiversity.
So you're saying that's a greater good than their possible toileting requirements while they're in there?
Yeah, on a cost-benefit kind of a arrangement, yes. They do more good than harm up there when we've had them there.
Thank you.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Moving on. Can I just understand from you, I guess, to clarify for me your responses around the lines of questioning that Councillor Johnson was raising? Could we understand from that other communities in New Zealand are successfully managing at least some level of overlap between water supply and recreational use?
Well, there clearly are some areas. I mean, if we take the western parts of Auckland, I mean, there are areas there. But again, I think you'll find that there are restrictions around the direct catchment inflows where the owners or the territorial authorities or water supply agencies have control. The more common arrangement is that the catchments are not in the entire control of the authority. So essentially, as David has already alluded, they receive a lower grade in terms of level of protection of that catchment, and as a result, they have to put in place higher levels of treatment and risk management. So, I mean, yes, there are plenty of catchments where there are not only a recreational activity, but there's agricultural activity and farming and all the rest of it. So, yeah. We have a unique opportunity, I suppose, a unique position where we have, there are still small areas which are currently farmed within the catchment, which we don't have control over. But the majority of the catchment is within our management, so we can achieve a very high level of confidence around the risk management for the raw water supply.
Yep. Thank you. So then to, I guess, expand on your point there around some issues around proximity, and there's a difference between inviting people to take a swim in the reservoir or perhaps inviting them to ride along the ridgeline. As I understand it, the ridgeline sits 1 to 1.5 kilometers away from the reservoir, and that there's no access from South Range Road down to the reservoir. Is that?
There's no road access or track access. There are tracks within the catchment for the purposes of biodiversity management and trapping and that sort of thing. So, but yeah, any access by hunters, for instance, would be by foot down through into the catchment. Yeah.
Great, thank you. The secondary questioning was actually around how we go about the scope setting and consultation process, and just interested in understanding if we stay with this narrow scope here around the 2 items that are in the officer's recommendation. If we were to get quite a strong signal back from the community around something else, like, say, recreational use, would that be able to be accommodated within an adjustment to the plan at that stage, or would that possibly trigger a second round of consultation so that we were sure of the wider community's views around that potential change?
Well, there's nothing, in any consultation process, there's nothing to stop you. You've gone out with a draft, you've got submissions. The really engagement is around preparing the draft. So we're looking to make sure that engagement is effective and meets their aspirations. There may be some other things which we haven't mentioned here that come from that engagement, so that's not closed. But really what we're saying is when we go out to the wider community, then you receive a whole bunch of submissions. Of course, there's nothing to stop council indicating that they would like to give effect to some of those submissions within the draft in some way. That of course remains on the table. Yeah, and it's not necessary to go back again out to consult if you're making changes which are based on that feedback. So,
thanks for that. I guess just finally then to understand your closing comment there around it being not necessary. But it could in fact be prudent at that time to go and seek community feedback if we were to make a further significant adjustment after the first round of consultation. We would want to ensure at that point that we had full community input on it.
Yeah, I suppose I'd return to the purpose of the review, that there's a legal obligation around us when we're managing a reserve to be clear about the purpose of the reserve and to give effect to that purpose through the document. It's not necessarily to meet all of the aspirations of the community around what that area of land may be able to offer. If council wants to extend or change the range of that becomes their decision. So, I think ultimately it's council who makes a decision about changes to the scope of the reserve management plan, not the community. So,
thank you. That's helpful, Madam Chair.
Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My first question about the animal fecal contamination has already been answered. Second, on page 157, 2.4, it says, and I know there is a reference of a publication as well. Is this reserve really represents 90% of Palmerston North ecology?
I think what we're probably trying to say there is that 90% of the biodiversity that you can find across Palmerston North is reflected or is present within the catchment. Okay, so there are 10% of species which you would find elsewhere that are not found in the reserve, but 90% of the species you'll find across Palmerston North, native flora and fauna, you will find within the catchment, so within the reserve.
All right, thank you.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Sorry, just coming back with another question. So you mentioned the downgrading, I suppose, of the catchment that would occur if we opened up to the public. And you mentioned like a level 3 or a level 4 or something, which would then require us to increase the level of water treatment. So can you just explain a little bit more about what the criteria are for being in each of those levels and who makes that decision?
Yeah, the determination is made in the drinking water standards of New Zealand. So, and I mean, while we interpret those now, currently we are aware there will be significant changes to those drinking water standards, likely to be promulgated on 1st July, and they are likely to get more stringent. So we would expect that, not only at the moment, the drinking water standards are somewhat recommendatory. I mean, they're advisory. They will become compulsory and mandatory. So, I mean, David could elaborate back on the change. It's a log credit. The idea of, you know, a log being 1/10. So when two log is 1%, 3 log is 0.1%, 4 log is 0.00. You know, again. So, I mean, it's really a question of a risk balance, and you've seen essentially the emphasis on drinking water quality and standards across the country. What we will see is a much more risk-averse approach. So we expect the drinking water standards to become even tighter around these requirements. I can't predict, but I mean, if we moved to, as sort of indicated by the line in questioning, to open up the reserve to public access, pretty much I think we could guarantee that we probably have to implement UV disinfection at Turitea as an investment. So that would be
So just to check that I understand the answer then, at the moment we decide where we sit in those standards? No, someone else decides.
We have agreed that we will comply with those standards. And we meet the standards at the moment. We're expecting those standards to get more onerous. So there will be potentially a change, again to the level of, so while we comply at the moment without UV treatment, the combination of opening up for public access and the more risk-averse approach in the drinking water standards pretty much guarantees, I think, a change in the level of treatment that we would have to provide.
So the exact process, Councillor, is called a catchment risk assessment, and that is a report that's on the water supplier to have prepared, and that gets, at the moment, submitted to the District Health Board, and the drinking water assessor in their unit assesses that. So at the moment, we will have a current catchment risk assessment that sits with them, recommends we're 3 log, and they have said, yes, you are. The risk is that if it was opened up, the next time we had to do one, or they may even trigger it, they say, well, you've done this, you need to redo it, is that we would lose that and we would become a 4 log catchment. You can think of it as a point system. So they're saying at the moment you only need 3 points. So you get 1 by doing this, you get half by doing this. If we need that extra point, like it's only 1 point, but it's a significant thing.
That's a very helpful answer, thank you. So in terms of opening up the reserve to the public, is it an all or nothing thing in that drinking water assessment? So is it, so for example, is it if you open up the reserve, you automatically go up to the next level, or does it relate to the number of people that are allowed, or does it relate to a physical measurement of the water?
The difficulty we have at the moment is we're in uncertain territory. We can tell you what the setup is at the moment, but when Taumata Arawai has its powers coming to life on 1 July, we can't say what they'll do with the process. And as Robert said, across the board, the general trend is it's more stringent. There's more requirements on council. We're going to need a catchment management plan which sits outside of our water safety plan. So it's likely to get, I wouldn't say worse, it's likely to get harder, not easier. And the risk is that even if we made our decisions based on the current regime, that changes 1 July.
Okay, so is it all or nothing with the public, or not?
It's still a risk assessment, but it's not a risk assessment made by ourselves. Right. Okay, so it'll be made by the water regulator, and every indication is they're extremely risk averse. So.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robert and David. There's no further questions. So we have got a recommendation, a slightly amended recommendation from what officers have put forward from Councillor Barrett. So we'll bring that up, and that is moved by Councillor Barrett. Seconded by Councillor Bowen. Councillor Barrett, I'll invite you to speak to that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. What I'm seeking to do with this amendment is to just carefully broaden the scope around the conversation that we have with the community. I'm certainly not suggesting that we want to jump to the end point and make a firm decision at all about which way we should be going on this. As we've just heard, there's a number of moving parts in terms of the regulatory responses through central government and different levels of risk that we might see develop on our side in terms of how we might manage the reserve in future. The point that I'm seeking to advance here is simply that we should have the full conversation with the community at the outset and get those community views around this. There has been long-standing interest around recreational access to parts of the Turitea Reserve, and I think that we need to give the opportunity for that discussion to happen in the community and out in public. We've heard from officers today that there are a number of examples around the country where recreational access and water supply are successfully managed on an ongoing basis. Yes, some things have to change, but as we've just heard as well, the regulator might tell us we're doing UV treatment anyhow. So what we want to do here is give the community a chance to have their say. That will actually take until July or beyond. At July, we will know what the regulator is going to do. And then I think we'd be in a position to make a very informed decision. So this is simply suggesting that we should have the conversation and hear from the community. Now, when you see the specific wording here, I have suggested that we constrain it to ridgeline access for recreational purposes of walking, running, and mountain biking. There is a formed track or road called South Range Road that runs along the ridge, and to my mind, given that there is not direct access from that further down into the reserve, and in fact there's about 1 kilometer of impenetrable bush between the road and the catchment, and the reservoir, that's an appropriate level of access to start a conversation with the community about. We certainly, to my mind, would not be wise to invite a conversation around access into the lower areas or, in fact, onto the reservoirs. So this is keeping it quite a distance geographically from that. But again, the principal request here is simply to ensure that we have a full conversation with the community at the outset so that we can make a well-informed decision when we have community views back as well as information from the regulator. Madam Chair.
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, happy to support the amended recommendation and grateful for Councillor Barrett's careful scoping of what it is that we're seeking to invite public comment on at this stage. The Turitea Reserve is our largest reserve in the city. It's by far the biggest resource that we have in terms of biodiversity, and obviously it's incredibly significant to our community for safe water supply. So we would want to step carefully in this space, but I do think there is a slight extension possible. I was encouraged by the answers around the dam block route, that we are actually bringing people quite close to that catchment already, and there hasn't been any negative impact to that. And also that our community understand that they're coming quite close to that catchment, and they don't, or there seems to be no evidence that they're hopping the fence and encroaching into the parts where they shouldn't be. So it seems to me that we can have this conversation without raising expectation beyond what we can manage, and recognising that there is just a request for information at this stage. So I hope elected members feel able to support it.
I'll just make a quick comment. I'm happy to support the recommendations from Councillor Barrett. I guess my only hesitation will be hearing from officers around what may be required in terms of treatment if we do sort of open this up. And so I'm happy to go out and have that conversation with our community, and I think it would be really important to say, you know, if we are expanding on our recreational activity in this space, because as Councillor Bowen's just pointed out, there is some limited activity there at the moment, these may be the cost implications should we need to increase treatment or whatever may be required. So I'm happy to go out so that our community, as Councillor Barrett said, do participate in that wider, full conversation. But I think it is really important that we are really clear that should this happen, these may be the flow-on effects from that. And so I'll support it with the understanding that actually it's about including this in the conversation. It's not a decision we're making. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Yes, I support Councillor Barrett's recommendation, and also would, and I think it is alluded to in the paper, support more recreational access to Hardings Park, which is outside the water catchment area. And I just bring us back to the public comment that we received today from Shane from the Mountain Bike Club, which is that there is a significantly increased demand. We've got a growing population. Active recreation is an important aspect of, you know, a healthy life, both physically and mentally. And we've got a fantastic reserve that at the moment is unavailable to, you know, a population of 90,000 living, you know, a couple of kilometres away. So I totally appreciate the risks around water catchment and so on, but I will point out, as the officers mentioned, that increased treatment requirements are coming. And a protozoa that comes from a deer is no different than from a protozoa that comes from a person, and that we already have treatment in place to deal with bacteria and protozoa. Now, I understand it might have to be a different treatment or to a different level, but I think we just need to be open to opening up a really large piece of reserve for a little bit more recreational use. So I think it would be very helpful to be able to consult publicly on recreational expansion of this reserve and see what comes back. And if there is, as I suspect there will be, a demand for it, then we might need to be in a position at that stage to look at what that would, the implications of that, the cost implications as well as the practical implications. And as the officers have suggested by then, we might already be in a different environment anyway with regards to water. So I do support these recommendations, and I assume that recreational use of Hardings Park will be included, as is mentioned in 3.2 in the report. Thank you.
Are there any further comments? Councillor Barrett, would you like a right of reply? Okay, I'll invite you to vote. And that has carried 100%. Moving on to item 8, the Kahutarawa Outdoor Recreation Plan Review, page 181, and we've got Kathy and Aaron coming down to speak to that.
Thank you, Chair and councillors. It's by no coincidence that this report is on the agenda at the same time as item 7, and that is really because they're such closely related reserves as to enable those processes to occur at the same time. The council has two options regarding the review of the plan. One is to follow a Reserves Act process, and one is to follow an alternative Reserves Act process. We're proposing that you follow the alternative process. The only difference between the two processes is that we would, under the full Reserves Act process, we would publicly notify our intention to undertake a review, and therefore inviting feedback from the public on the scope. We are recommending the alternative because we're not constraining the scope of the review. We already have an existing plan. What we're saying is that it's quite clear from the intentions going forward that the scope and the intent of the area hasn't remarkably changed, so we do not see the need to go out to the public to notify that we're going to do the plan, that the review process itself will fully encompass the scope or any matters that the community may wish to raise. I don't know if Aaron's got any further comments?
I think it's fair to say, councillors, that we understand the space fairly well. We're familiar with most of the issues. You've had some of them come before you in the past. We have excellent relationships with most of the stakeholders, and there will still be a stage of public consultation. It will be just at the point at which we've worked through with the stakeholders what their issues might be and what changes we might propose to the draft. And after you'd seen the draft, we would then go back out to the community to say, okay, this is how we think it's shaping for the future, and what do you have to say on that? So.
Thank you. Councillor Barrett, you've got a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Page 189 and 190 have a very thorough list of what's planned by way of review process, and firstly to say thanks to the officers for laying it out so clearly and thoroughly. My question arises on the second of those pages, page 190, around item 10. So in that item, there's a reference to exotic forestry, which is obviously a subset of forestry. And these days, there's other sort of forestry uses that can provide economic benefit. Obviously, Manuka honey is probably the poster child for those sort of uses. But just wondering why we've gone with a specific around exotic forestry, and whether it might be prudent to just ask a bit of a broader question there around forestry, full stop.
Thank you, Councillor. The reason exotic forestry is specifically mentioned is that the area includes the Gordon Care Forest, which is Council's pine plantation forest that remains. The woodpecker forest, which was originally in a pine forest and was harvested, has been replanted in a mixed exotic long-lived species layout. Excuse me if I don't get my forestry language quite right. It has pockets of different species that live different lengths and have much longer lives than pine, so that we never get to the situation again where we're clear felling the entire site and damaging the resources that have built up around recreation there. In addition, the revegetation of the margins of the streams is in context, but it's captured within the environmental ecology focus group area rather than being labelled forestry.
Thanks, that's really helpful in terms of understanding, I guess, the present allocation of land use. I guess, you know, thinking about the future of the Gordon Care, the fact that it's in exotic forestry today doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be in there forever. And so what I'm trying to get at is where we might start the conversation about possibly transitioning to other forestry uses of that weren't solely exotic, and whether this review, given that it's a periodic review, would be a prudent opportunity to start that conversation.
That point is noted, and we will ensure that when we are looking at the focus groups in more detail as we progress this, should you adopt the recommendation, that we will expand to consider those matters.
Thank you both, Madam Chair.
Councillor Hapara.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Aaron and Kathy. On page 190, and also looking at number 10 in recreation, obviously mountain biking is one of the groups of recreation. What were the other groups of recreation were you looking at?
We'll keep that fairly broad, but the existing uses up there include walking and tramping, with the sledge track and the extension of that's occurred over the last 10 years, and the loops that have been created. It's quite popular, and a lot of volunteering has gone into building those tracks. There are variously other recreation activities that take place on a limited basis. In the past, there's been discussion about orienteering and those sorts of activities, but we haven't seen a lot of that actually come to the fore. But principally the walking and mountain biking.
We also have hunting and trail running, so the activities are quite wide up there. Some of it is formal, but we recognise that during our public consultation we need to be also picking up informal uses as well. We have a group that manage the area on our behalf, and so that group has quite a bit of information about the other people that are using it. We also have the Te Araroa Trail, so as a particular stakeholder group. Obviously, they're representing people that don't live in the city, but they know the usage and they're getting anecdotal feedback from their national bodies.
Thank you. So the consultation will include all of those different areas?
Yes, it will.
Great, thank you.
Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the report. Just a supplementary question on officers' comments on replacing these forests with the long-term or long exotic species. To me, we select exotic species only due to the rotation privilege, that they are quite short-term benefits. If the aim is not commercial or short-term forestry, why we are preferring exotic species on native species? Why can't we plant native species there?
Thank you, Councillor. At the time that the 2008 plan was formed, we had a forestry expert involved in developing the plan. At that time, there was a view that we would like some economic benefit from the plantations, but that we didn't. That needed to be balanced with the recreational aspects. So there are. I should have brought the map with me. It might have helped, but there are, I would say, in the order of 8 to 10 different species of trees planted in pockets through the reserve, which have different lives and lengths and different purposes. They will generate some economic benefit, but it'll be much outside our lifetimes.
That is a matter that may be raised by the public, or maybe something that the council wants to consider. Remembering that the revenue from the forestry is used towards the ongoing maintenance and development of this reserve, and that was a direction that was set by council, and in the 2008 plan we sought to balance the biodiversity, the recreational access, the economic benefits of forestry across the whole reserve. We've had no signal that is wishes to change, and that is how you see to fund this reserve going forward, but that may be something for consideration as we develop the draft plan.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Kathy and Aaron. There's no further questions. I'm happy to move the recommendation in front of us, seconded by Councillor Hapara. Are there any comments? Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just briefly, firstly, to thank and acknowledge the officers for putting together a really clear report, including the work plan description. I thought that was really helpful to actually understand the specifics of what was going to happen there. And secondly, just to acknowledge and thank them for taking on board the point around the difference between zooming into exotic forestry straight away as the forever future, but instead choosing to look at a bit wider conversation there. I think, I hope that New Zealand's moving from a paradigm where the way that you make money out of forestry is just one species and pretty destructive harvesting practices as we've seen of recent times, and thinking about more sustainable and alternative approaches to forestry that can include some native species as well. Again, the Manuka honey stories really come to the fore over the last number of years. There's probably other stories there, but I think we should take a really open approach to what the future land use is in this area and see that we can get the best fit for the future. So appreciate the officers taking that on board, and really look forward to this review because it's a very exciting part of our city, both from a biodiversity and nature point of view, as well as a recreational point of view. So I think it'll be good fun to get through this. Madam Chair.
Councillor Hapara.
I also really appreciate this report, and I do think from a recreational point of view that the users will really appreciate the consultation process. I do appreciate what the officer said in terms of the revenue that's gained from this report goes back to the maintenance of this park, and I think it's a really good point that she brought that up, and we do undervalue that, and I think that what the revenue that is gained, it should be part of the consultation process so that it is made aware to those people that we are consulting on, that they do really value that and that they can see that as part of the consultation process. So I think it's a really good point. So well done to the officers. I think, is what Councillor Barrett said, that table that they did put forward is on attachment 1 is a very good table, because it did outline what we are going to consult on. Thank you.
Thank you. With no further questions, I'll invite you to vote. Sorry, no further comments. That has carried 100%. Moving on to item 9, the review of significance and engagement policy, page 191, and Andrew is here to speak to that.
Madam Chair, councillors, thank you. By legislation, significance and engagement policy has quite a prescribed purpose, but in the past we also tried to use it to describe council's overall approach to consultation and its relationship with iwi. That was largely because there were no other documents that did that when we first developed the policy. We now have the relationship agreement with Rangatane and a good governance and active citizenship plan. So what we can put the overall approach to our relationship with iwi and our overall approach to consultation into those higher level documents where I think they belong, and return the significance and engagement policy to meeting its legal requirements. None of this changes what the council does, it just puts that in what I think is the right place. I guess the other change to note in here is that we are recommending that the Manawatu River Park, Linklater Park and Globe Theatre become strategic assets. That would mean they couldn't be basically sold without consulting through a 10-year plan. And of course, just a reminder, this recommendation is to go out to consultation on the draft policy in conjunction with the 10-year plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Andrew. I've just got some questions around attachment 1 on page 201, which is the list of the strategic assets. So in point 3 of your report, you did note the changes that you'd made to the policy overall and the assets that had been added, but I just wanted to be sure that no assets have been removed from this list. Okay, thank you. And then, is there any particular reason why Square Edge Community Art Hancock House are not listed under these strategic assets?
Other than in some ways the test of a strategic asset is how critical is this for council to achieve its vision and goals. So I kind of do a mental test. If there was a very, very local earthquake and a particular building liquefied down, would that affect the city in a very major basis? So if this building disappeared, then yes. If Fitzherbert Avenue and the road end disappeared, then yes. If Hancock House, as long as it was empty at the time, yeah, probably not. But that's just a judgment call.
Okay.
Yep.
Because I mean, I note that Keisha Birch, for example, is listed as strategic asset. But the test that you've just talked about, I personally wouldn't see that Keisha Birch would be any different in that test to Hancock House or Square Edge Community Arts. In fact, there might be a lesser argument there.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, it is judgment. I think if you took Keisha Birch as a meeting venue, then I would say yes. If you were talking about the heritage of it, then I would say that can't be replaced.
Okay, but I accept what you're saying, that it's a judgment. So if council was minded to add other strategic assets to the list, Is that just a request, or does it need to have does it need to have an amendment, or?
I would suggest the best way is to have a recommendation at this council, so it's very clear that that is the direction that the council wants to take. But yes, they can be added in if that is what you wish.
Thank you. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you. Councillor Johnson has traversed some of my areas of questioning, so I see she's writing up a notice and I'll be happy to second that. Andrew, how will the community know that we're consulting on this as part of the 10-year plan?
So there'll be a page in the consultation document that talks about other consultation. It will be mentioned on that, and it will be available in all of the draft policy will be available generally through the 10-year plan consultation.
So would we, in that part of the 10-year plan, would we give examples of how people might have experienced the impact of our significance and engagement policy? I'm thinking of things like College Street, where we've had significant feedback on how our engagement and then consultation didn't meet community expectations. So would we be drawing people's attention to it to say, if you've not been happy, this is where you need to tell us?
I think that comes back to the previous point about the significance and engagement policy being quite a low-level technical document. Its main purpose is to set out how council will define what are significant decisions and to list its strategic assets. I would think that any discussion around the adequacy of council's community engagement is more of a good governance and active citizenship plan discussion.
And that does come through in your report, so thank you for that. And you talk about that being reported, that monitoring of that plan being reported annually through the city dashboards. But that seems to me to be quite functional and doesn't really talk about the overarching how we do engagement and consultation.
I mean, I think one thing that we need to put emphasis on is that when reports come to council that are talking to you about results of consultation, that we do talk about the what worked and what didn't work in that. And I just had a quick look at one of the previous items on today's meeting that talked about the consultation process.
So you say when those things come through, there's always an opportunity to reflect that back into the plan itself, as well as specifically on that item?
Yes. And I think that is a more appropriate place to do it.
Thank you very much.
Councillor Denison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A couple of queries. One is around, is the railway land zoned recreational, or is it in a city? It has a wider use, I understood.
Zoned recreation.
It is? Okay, so that's covered in there. And I just wanted to query around the rationale of including the Globe Theatre, because there's some other examples that have already been queried, because I see it in a similar light. And when you compare that, the convention centre, for example, was not included, from what I can interpret. How does the Globe Theatre make the threshold? I'd rather see it tested for people to put it in rather than us put it in and see otherwise. So I just want some thoughts of how that was processed. And was it considered? Is there others that were considered and didn't make the list this time through?
The Globe Theatre, in previous reviews of the policy, it's been requested that we put it in. At that time, council didn't, because it didn't have such a high profile in council's plans, arts and culture plan, and council's strategic direction. So the general impression and staff advice at the time was it didn't qualify. I think now with the council's strategic direction and the higher profile of the Globe, it does fit. We did think about were there any other assets that needed to be added, but didn't deliberately consider the Hancock House, for example. It was just part of that judgment call. It didn't come to mind at the time.
Has the public art installations been considered as a suite of assets?
Not in this context.
Okay, they were just queries. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks, Andrew. On the same page, but a little bit different line of questioning, just around, I guess, consistency of language and how we're going to hopefully tidy this up and communicate it out. But for instance, there's reference about a quarter of the way down the list of bullet points to the square and Te Maraeohene, and I sort of thought that the square was Te Maraeohene and Te Maraeohene was the square, and just wondering if you'd be able to have a further look at that language before we go public with it.
Sure. Yes.
Great, thank you.
Councillor Butt.
My question is...
Thank you, Andrew. There's no further questions.
Okay.
I am happy to move the recommendation on the screen, seconded by Councillor Hancock. There is also an additional recommendation from Councillor Johnson, which we will get up on the screen now, and I'll invite comment on both of those recommendations. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. So the reason that I'm suggesting that Square Edge and Hancock House are added to the list of council's strategic assets is because listing them in here gives them an extra level of protection. Whilst we might feel that they're quite safe at the moment and we wouldn't consider selling them off, that doesn't necessarily mean that any future council might not take the same view. And by putting them in this list, it means that they need to have that extra level of consultation before anything can be done to them. So I think it's a really important criteria that's mentioned at the top of the bottom of page 200 under the Local Government Act, saying that a strategic asset is any group of assets that the local authority needs to retain, etc., that the local authority determines to be important to the current or future well-being of the community. And recently, as you'll be aware, the 4 well-beings were added to re-added to the Local Government Act, and I would contend that Hancock House and Square Edge contribute significantly to the social and cultural well-being of the community, and therefore are appropriate to be in the list of strategic assets. And I think the officer also mentioned that with Council's strategic direction being focused very much on our 4 goals around economic well-being, creative and livable, connected communities and eco-city, that the strategic direction, that the strategic assets should also reflect the strategic direction of Council. And so since we have a much higher profile for arts and community development than we've had previously, I think it'd be appropriate that these 2 were listed along with all the other assets.
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Happy to support the officer's recommendation, obviously, that this goes out with the 10-year plan. It's an important part of our business as usual of the 10-year plan that sometimes gets a bit overlooked in the excitement of new budget lines, but particularly supporting the recommendation that Councillor Johnson has brought forward. For all of the reasons she said, also the officer's report notes that strategic assets might include things that might not strictly meet a legal definition, but can be included because of their high community importance and interest. And so if you don't feel convinced on the legal argument, you might feel convinced of their high community importance. I'll note particularly for Square Edge that Square Edge is included in Council's arts plan as a significant regional facility. So if we're saying it on one hand, then we should probably say it on the other, and this certainly provides a level of protection to a building that has significant earthquake issues. It's a significant heritage building in what I certainly hope will become the corner of our cultural precinct. So it's a building that we might need to give an additional layer of protection to, bearing in mind what might be coming down the road in that earthquake strengthening discussion as well. So I would certainly encourage elected members to support both recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. With no further comments, I'll invite you to vote. We will vote on both recommendations. That has carried 100%. Moving on to item 10, the committee work schedule on page 205. And I'll hand over to the General Manager to make some comments.
Just one comment regarding the consultation on the future use of Summerhay Street Bowling Green site. So suggest that is, well, the work schedule is amended to have an estimated report date of May 2021. We are having a conversation with the infrastructure unit about the possibility of a report coming to the April council meeting to seek some broad direction on the future use of Summerhay before we then prepare a consultation document to come to this committee.
Thank you, David. And just note that the recommendations that we have passed today around plan reviews and consultations and the like will also have an element of reporting back, so they'll be added to the work schedule as well. Councillor Beattie.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Whereabouts is Huria Street sitting? Is it on this work schedule?
Until such time as the legislation has changed. So the first step was to change the legislation, and the second step was to if the legislation has changed, to then bring back a zoning proposal development. So
can we have an update about where that's at, being that it's an urgent need?
Yeah, we can add an update to the work schedule.
Thank you.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. Just in terms of item 4, the progression of the Civic and Cultural Precinct Master Plan, the current position is seeking expressions of interest to progress report. I'm just wondering if we could have some clarity as to what the purpose of that report is, or will be.
So that report will report back on the significant piece of work that is scheduled to happen next financial year, assuming the budget is approved as part of the LTP. So it will effectively be reporting back on the Civic and Cultural Precinct Master Plan.
So is the purpose of that report to outline the consultation process?
No.
So the direction that was given in April of 2019 was to consult the community on the draft Civic and Cultural Precinct Master Plan. So I'm just wondering what council direction there has been given to progress the report that doesn't involve the consultation with the community on that draft?
So the recommendation included consultation on the draft, but it included, it included some words along the lines of including options for the library, because the Civic and Cultural Precinct Master Plan completed at the time didn't include the library. So in order to consult on a Civic and Cultural Precinct Plan, Master Plan including options for the library, further work is required before we can undertake consultation. So there will be consultation after it is reported back to this committee, but to bring back a Master Plan with library options, further work is required.
Okay. And just in terms of the 3+ year time frame from the direction to the estimated report date, is there any context you can give around why that process is taking so long, and how long it might be expected to deliver on the direction that council gave in terms of the consultation process? If the consultation process is a further step after the report, it'd be good to understand how long it may be till we're looking at consulting on that draft plan?
So the reason for the delay is it's going to be a very significant piece of work and there's no resources to undertake it at the moment. So that's why there's a budget being put up to the draft LTP. So if the budget is approved, the work would be undertaken and a master plan would be reported back to council, and then it would proceed with library options and it would proceed for consultation.
Thank you.
I think just to comment, Councillor, I think your questions have probably alluded to the fact that the subject title is not super clear, and so maybe we can review that so that it's a bit more transparent that actually what we're doing is pulling together a draft master plan essentially to come to elected members for approval for consultation. Yep. So we'll review that for the next meeting. Great, there's no further questions, so I will move that we receive our work schedule, seconded by Councillor Hancock. Any comments? Great, I'll invite you to vote. And that has carried 100%. With no further business, excuse me, nō reira, na mihi nui ki e koutou, ina mana, ina reo, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So we will take a break and meet in the